Prakash Santana, Deloitte, James Smith, Elliptic, and Zuko Wilcox, Zcash.
We got all the water.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. We have a little housekeeping before we get started. Any proof of work finalists should leave right now and meet Ryan at the 7th floor elevators. Hopefully that's not all of you. A little other housekeeping is you probably heard from other moderators. You're welcome to go to slido.com and use the event code #consensus to submit or vote for a question. We're going to do our best to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the event. But we'll, of course, be around for the next couple of days for those of you who ask questions that we can't get to. With that out of the way, we're going to each do some brief intros, and we'll get into it. My name is Jason Weinstein, as the voice of God said. I was a federal prosecutor for 15 years, and during the last third of that time was the criminal division official responsible for cybercrime and organized crime. And after 15 years of getting companies and individuals into trouble, now at Steptoe I try to keep companies and individuals out of trouble. I also have the privilege, along with my colleague Alan Cohn, who's here, of leading the Blockchain Alliance, which is a coalition of 20 companies and 17 law enforcement organizations that is using education and engagement to both protect public safety and to help the growth of the industry by getting law enforcement more comfortable with the technology, reducing their anxiety about it, and ultimately protecting public safety while also promoting a pro-growth legal and regulatory environment. James?
I'm James Smith, the CEO of Elliptic. My background was computer science PhD, and then became a derivatives trader for a few years before founding Elliptic. At Elliptic, we identify suspicious activity in the Bitcoin blockchain. So we provide anti-money laundering services to companies who process Bitcoin transactions to help them understand where they've got a higher risk associated with a particular transaction. And we also work with law enforcement agencies in order to trace illicit activity and help them build a case around a particular suspect.
Thanks, James. My name is Prakash Santana, no relation to Carlos. I lead payments, fraud, and risk at Deloitte. Previously, I used to manage fraud globally at MasterCard, hence the interest in cryptocurrencies, because it's a payment value transfer protocol. Been in the fraud business for about 23 years, preventing fraud, that is. We do. So happy to be here and talk about this topic.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Klein. I'm a partner at Baker Marquardt. I'm a former federal prosecutor also. I've been fortunate to be involved in this space since 2013 and represent a lot of the companies, entrepreneurs, and early adopters in regulatory defense, criminal defense, or civil litigation. And I'm also on the board of advisors of Blockseer, which is also a blockchain database analytics company.
My name is Zuko, and my background is cryptography and computer science, and I'm the founder of the Zcash company. Zcash is a technology for encrypting the data that you put into a blockchain so that you can control who gets to see what data in the blockchain. And when you apply that to an open blockchain like Bitcoin, you get a privacy-preserving currency.
Thank you all. So what we're going to do over the next 35 minutes or so is try to give you a sense of where things are today when it comes to anonymity and digital currencies, and where we think things are headed as innovation continues in the years ahead. But before we can understand where we are and where we're going, we thought it'd be useful to spend a minute talking about where we've been. So I'm going to try to put the debate about anonymity and law enforcement when it comes to digital currencies in a little bit of historical context. I often say that any technology worth adopting is adopted first by criminals. Criminals are like the beta testers for any new technology, and if the criminals aren't beta testing your technology, there may be something wrong with it. And they will keep using it after beta testing it if it works, if it's fast, if it's convenient, if it makes their lives easier. And they'll also keep using it if they find that it provides a degree of anonymity, or at least a degree of protection from the eyes and ears of law enforcement. And every single time there is an innovation that criminals adopt first, law enforcement has to play catch up. There is a period of time where the criminals figure out first how to exploit the technology, and the law enforcement people have to learn to understand it and investigate crimes facilitated with it. There are many, many examples of law enforcement having to figure out how to catch criminals who use new school technology to commit old school crimes. And time again, they figure out how to do it. And it's been as true as phones and fax machines and pagers and burner phones and email and chat and Skype and VoIP and PayPal. There's so many examples of situations where criminals seized on the opportunities presented by a technology and law enforcement had to catch up to them. And they always do. Every single time there's a new innovation, the law enforcement people, in complete good faith, think that the world is coming to an end, that we're never going to solve another crime, might as well just shut the whole thing down and give the world over to criminals. This one we're never going to figure out how to solve, and they do. Sometimes it takes a few months, sometimes it takes a few years, but they do adapt, just in time for some new innovation to come along to screw them over and change the world again. For decades, we've seen this repeated cycle of innovation and adaptation. And perhaps the greatest example is the internet itself. Criminals figured out how to use the internet before just about anybody except Al Gore, and way before anybody in law enforcement did. And as with other types of new technology, law enforcement had to get up a learning curve to figure out how to catch them. And the greatest challenge, and it's still the greatest challenge today in investigating online crime, is anonymity, or trying to do attribution, which prosecutors and agents call putting fingers at the keyboard. Trying to connect a string of letters and numbers and characters to a real human being is the hardest part of investigating any online crime, and that's been true since before Craig Wright invented Bitcoin. I heard that somewhere. Is that true? And it is made harder when the person who you're after, using those strings of letters and numbers and characters, uses Tor and proxies and other anonymizing techniques to try to obscure their identity. But each time law enforcement has to adapt, and they figure out how to do it. And there's a new anonymizing technology invented, and they have to figure out how to deal with that too. So the takeaway from all of that is that Bitcoin and digital currencies more generally, and the blockchain, represent just the latest chapter in this cycle of innovation and adaptation. And the question of anonymity in law enforcement as it applies to digital currencies and the blockchain is not new, and it's certainly not unique to the blockchain. It is endemic to any crime committed using technology in any way. And it's something that law enforcement has had to grapple with for years. And this, again, is just a new twist on an old story. But the twist in this case, as we'll talk about, is actually favorable to law enforcement, because when law enforcement does catch up and figure out how to use this technology, they will discover that unlike other technologies that came before it, this one is actually friendlier to cops than it is to criminals. That there are advantages to Bitcoin and the blockchain and other digital technologies that use a blockchain that are so advantageous to law enforcement that criminals should run, not walk, from any system using a blockchain. They don't know that yet, but they eventually will figure that out. So let's talk to our panel now, with that history lesson out of the way, about where we are today and how we think this cycle of innovation and adaptation is going to unfold in the years ahead. So let me start with Prakash. You read in the paper every day, Bitcoin is anonymous, Bitcoin is anonymous. If you stop 5 people on the street outside the hotel today and you ask them about Bitcoin, if they've heard of it, they will say that it's anonymous. Is that true? And if it's not true, why is that not true?
Okay, great question. So if you look at anonymity in the cryptocurrency framework, there are basically 2 parts to it. The first part is, if you look at an entity, are you aware of a collection of all the addresses that belong to the entity? That's the first part. Being able to link a collection of public addresses to an entity. The second part is, are you able to see a transaction that belongs to this entity that potentially happened at a KYC AML compliant exchange? Because then you can track the entity. So let's talk about the first part, being able to arrive at the collection of addresses that belong to an entity. There are tools today, I'm sure James will talk more about this, that could potentially use graph theoretic techniques and clustering techniques to arrive at a probabilistic solution set that basically says, here are a list of addresses that are likely to belong to an entity. There are ways to do that. Of course, it needs data. You can't just track it with anonymous data. You need to be able to have the capacity to look at a collection of addresses, follow the transactions, follow transaction times, amounts, etc. So that's the first part. The second part is more difficult, because you need to be able to track an address that does a transaction at a KYC AML compliant exchange. That doesn't always happen because fraudsters can choose not to do that. And if they decide not to do that, you may have a collection of addresses, but you can't link to the entity. On top of that, there's there's an evolution in this whole space, like the Zcash. Sorry, I called it Zcash. Zcash. Doesn't matter. It's like a Zoolander movie. So Zcash, where it's called distributed anonymized payments. Basically, what it is it's a distributed mixing protocol, if you will. It's not a centralized mixer where you send your addresses and they mix it up so you don't really know where the money is going to. It's a distributed protocol. So obviously, it's going to get even more difficult to use technology or analytics to be able to track who's holding the transaction, because from what I've read about Zcash, it anonymizes the sender, the receiver, and the payment data. So there's nothing to analyze. So I'm sure Zcash will get into it, or Zuko will get into it. It becomes increasingly difficult to use analytics to track who's the entity behind it. But I always go back to what law enforcement does best. In times when it is difficult, they revert to low-tech methods, and they work. And I'll give you an example. I used to be managing fraud at MasterCard, and we had a program where merchants would do illegal activity, like child pornography and other things. And they would often have a web page that would be legitimate, that it would look like a legitimate business. They were selling flowers. So you'd use web crawlers to crawl into their websites to see if you can get at what they're doing. But oftentimes they're able to hide behind different pages and not even allow the web crawlers to be able to access the data. Then we tried to use a very low-tech method. It was very simple. Do a test transaction, see if you get the flowers. And of course, the flowers don't arrive. And then you start to investigate, investigate the transaction, and you find out that it's not a legitimate business, it's doing a lot of different things. There are other ways, like device fingerprinting, being able to monitor and grab information when people come onto a given site. I'm sure law enforcement has other capabilities that they can use collectively. Despite the advances, I'm sure there'll be a way to arrive at it. I don't have the answer to what we're going to do in the presence of in this new evolution, but clearly we will be able to find a way.
Thanks. And Zuko, before we get to the way that Zcash works and how it's going to change the game, I want to ask James to talk about how companies like his, like Elliptic, trace those breadcrumbs that people leave behind when they engage in transactions and marshal the data that the blockchain provides currently to help track and identify digital currency users.
Right. So we do a lot of what Prakash has just described. So we look at patterns of transactions. We understand where there is common ownership among a number of addresses, put things together into clusters. And that's something that is very Bitcoin specific. And in the current environment we're operating in, it's important to do that stuff, to understand where there is an entity, how that entity is transacted with another entity. But another important part of it beyond that clustering is really understanding the services, both legitimate and illegitimate services, to understand how they operate. So some of them are our clients, and we'll be providing anti-money laundering services to them. So understanding how those guys operate, how they want to work with the regulators, and make sure we're helping them do that. But also very much understanding the illicit actors in the ecosystem. So we spend a lot of time gathering data from the dark web, understanding how every marketplace works, how every mixing service works. So we start to see patterns of similarity between multiple entities, whether it's multiple mixing services or multiple marketplaces. And we're able to pull out features of each one that suggest, okay, here's a transaction that might be suspicious because it's connected to something that looks illicit.
Well, how much of a challenge do mixing services and tumblers and services like that present when you're trying to use an analytics tool like yours to track transactions?
It varies. Some of them are good and some of them are really not good. The different groups of customers we have look at them in different ways. So Some of our exchange clients will treat anything that's coming from a mixing service as potentially suspicious. Some of them are okay with with a mixing service. And it sort of depends on the mixer. If that is a mixer that is very closely associated with a lot of dark marketplaces, then you need to elevate the risk attached to that particular mixing service. Some of the, with enough analysis, so when a mixing service becomes popular enough that it matters to law enforcement, then we can start to dig into it. And I won't get into too much detail about how much you can figure out, but it's possible to figure stuff out from some mixing services. And I think this comes back to your point earlier about it being a cat and mouse game. They'll innovate, and then we'll catch up, and then they'll innovate, and we catch up.
Now, Zuko, we're going to talk in a few minutes about Zcash. You have made the observation to me in the past that Bitcoin involves what you call opt-in privacy. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so the mixing services that James was just mentioning are services in which a set of Bitcoin users can opt in to combine their transactions in order to obscure the relationship between where it came from and where it's going. What I was telling you, the reason I was telling you about that is that I think that opt-in privacy fundamentally can't achieve certain kinds of privacy that we want as a public policy objective, because I've worked in the computer security field for many years, and almost all users almost always use the default settings, right? Only a few people who are especially skilled or motivated will use anything else. Bitcoiners, it's also true of. They almost all use the default settings of their software or of the service that they use. And an example of the policy objective you might want that can't be achieved by opt-in privacy is fungibility, which is that all coins are created equal. If somebody's buying something from you with a $100 bill, you don't care which $100 bill they give you, as long as it's any real $100 bill. And like James was just saying, with opt-in privacy techniques, there do get to be multiple classes of $100 bills. There's $100 bills which recently came out of a mixer or others. And that, it seems to me, will inevitably lead to sand in the gears of commerce.
All coins are created equal is pretty catchy. You should put that on your website.
It's there.
Brian, if you kind of just focus on the press, you would think that the criminals are winning. You're a defense lawyer like me, and you've represented people in a lot of the bigger cases that law enforcement has brought in the digital currency space. Based on your participation in those cases and on others like Silk Road and Carl Force, what's your sense of how law enforcement is doing? Where do you think they are on the learning curve?
I think it really depends on what agency you go to, what prosecutor. There's no consistent sort of approach. There's no consistent level of knowledge or skill that they exercise. So you might have, prosecutors in San Francisco or New York City who have done a lot of these cases, and their agents, they're very sophisticated. But sometimes you go to a market where it's the first Bitcoin case they've had, and they've read what everyone else has read about Bitcoin and have very limited knowledge. So it really depends. I think there is more knowledge now and more awareness, and I think there's also more understanding that lots of people do use Bitcoins or other digital currencies for completely legitimate reasons. And one of the things I often have to do when talking with law enforcement is explain why this is a legitimate transaction, explain why this is someone who's doing something in good faith and with good reason, and just because they happen to have done it this way that they don't really quite understand doesn't mean it's criminal. So I think there is a better level of knowledge, but I think, I get paid to help educate law enforcement too when I advocate for a client.
So Prakash and others may want to jump in on this too. We focus a lot about the challenges that the blockchain and digital currencies present to law enforcement, but are there advantages that the blockchain presents from an investigative point of view?
Yeah. Not just investigate, auditing point of view, right? If you go back to the 2009 credit crisis, the biggest problem was we couldn't match the assets with the people holding the assets. So clearly, blockchain infrastructure provides a way to keep a perfect track record, perfect record, an audit trail of all the activities pertaining to an asset as it moves from one person to another. So clearly there's significant value, and that's why the financial industry is very interested in this. So for law enforcement purposes, auditing purposes, it provides a good audit trail. And
it's the worst way to launder money, on many levels.
Yeah.
Well, I think the important thing to remember there is that it's recorded forever.
Yeah,
And while we might not be able to figure it out today, we'll
Yeah.
figure it out tomorrow.
Yep. And of course, as we go into smart contracts, things will get even more interesting because then the contracts are sealed forever. So you can see what contract arrangement you had in the past and where is it today and who's holding the asset, et cetera. So it provides a very good audit trail.
You know, one of the things that when I talk to law enforcement people about this, one of their greatest challenges, for example, in child exploitation cases, is that if the person is savvy, they'll use proxy servers in different countries all over the world, and so you have to go through multiple hops and multiple IP addresses till you find the IP address of the actual person who abused their child. And it could take you 2 years to do that, going through multiple MLATs and going from country to country. And by the time you get to the right person, the ISP doesn't have the data anymore because they don't retain it for that long a period of time. And I always try to focus them on the fact that, as you said, James, the blockchain data is there. Yeah. So once you make the identification, you don't ever have to worry it's not going to be there. And you don't have to go to another country and ask for their help in getting it. You don't need an MLAT. You don't even necessarily need a subpoena, although you certainly need a subpoena from the exchanges and the wallet companies. But to get the data itself from the blockchain, it's all right there as long as you have an internet connection. But having said that, Brian, you and I have heard law enforcement people say on multiple occasions that the data from the blockchain is only useful if it can be connected to a real person. If there is data that comes back when they do serve a subpoena on an exchange or a wallet company, is it your sense that law enforcement is trying to make an example of non-compliant, what they believe are non-compliant wallet and exchange companies at this stage of the growth of the industry?
Absolutely, I think that's what they're trying to do. I happen to represent Anthony Murgio, who's connected to CoinMX. That's someone here in the Southern District they've alleged was running an unlicensed money transmittal service. And they send out press releases, they do those types of things. We saw the Ripple Labs settlement where that was brought up, and that got a lot of attention. And I represented Roger Ver there. And so they really try to send a message. I don't always think it's the right message, and sometimes I think they're wrong, particularly in the Ripple case. But I think that is something, and with my other client, Anthony, also. But I really do think that is something law enforcement wants to do. They want to let people know that one, they have these tools, two, they can use them, and three, they'll prosecute you if they think you're breaking the law. So I think that is out there.
So that's a kind of an overview of where things are today. Let's talk about how the game is going to change again as innovation continues. And that leads us back to you, Zuko. Talk to us about what Zcash is, how it differs from other digital currencies, why it is that you say all coins are created equal on your website, and how you think it will impact law enforcement.
Okay. First of all, Zcash is not the only game in town. There's a great demand both from all kinds of members of the public and also, slightly to my surprise, I found out about a year ago, there's a great demand from the financial industry. Banks, exchanges, payment processors, all kinds of players in the financial industry are very actively trying to figure out how they can use blockchain technology to optimize their business and disrupt the businesses of their neighbors. And what I've also found out in the last year is that they are some of the most specific in demanding a specific kind of privacy, which is control over disclosure of the data. So a blockchain to me is kind of just a funny variant of a database. And Zcash is one of several technologies which are attempting to satisfy this demand for a database with disclosure with control over disclosure of who gets to see the data. The way Zcash does it is by encrypting all of the data in the database and then providing the decryption key to the authorized parties. So therefore, it's not one of the opt-in kinds of privacy where everything is transparent by default and becomes protected only in special cases. It's the other way around, where everything is protected by default and becomes transparent on demand. But it's not like a lot of people start with the assumption that it's sort of the polar opposite of Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, everyone can see everything all the time, everything within the blockchain. And then, as we discussed, what's often important is correlating what's in the blockchain with other information from outside the blockchain. Zcash is not the opposite, where nobody can see anything. It's what we call selective transparency, where authorized parties can be granted the ability to see subsets of the data. And so it's going to, assuming that a technology like Zcash or Zcash itself becomes widely used, both as an open currency and also as a fundamental tool in blockchain deployments, for example, in finance. That will change. Your question was, how will that change things for law enforcement? Well, I'm not an expert on law enforcement, but I'm an expert on
Don't become one.
crypto and networking and things like that. And I can say that everything we've said so far on the panel, most but not all of that remains true if people are using this kind of technique. For example, we heard that a critical step in investigation is know your customer and anti-money laundering compliance on the part of an exchange. That would be the same if the exchange were supporting Zcash, and their compliance behavior would be the same. They would disclose the right information to law enforcement when presented with the right requests. So that part would be the same. We heard Prakash said clustering versus exchange. There was, I forget the other thing that I thought, oh yeah, that's the exact same thing with Zcash as with Bitcoin. Basically, the thing that changes is for law enforcement. Oh, I know what it was you said. You said that it's really important not only for enforcement, but for auditing. And I think that's really important. This is a panel about law enforcement, but law enforcement is not the most important thing in the world. But
And we shouldn't be building products for law enforcement, right?
Well,
I mean, you're not building Zcash so law enforcement can do their job. You're building it for other people.
well, it is compatible with law enforcement doing its job in the current the way we do it in the United States, where the interface between the financial system and law enforcement and also regulators is the compliance efforts of the financial service providers. So that part is compatible, but yes, I agree, there's a lot more value beyond being compatible with law enforcement that we want out of our blockchains and out of our open permissionless currencies. And so I was interested in the part about auditing and long-term historical look back, because that's also something that you do get in Zcash, but it's not obvious to people right away. All that data is in the blockchain in Zcash. And in fact, it might turn out that there's a lot more richer set of data that gets put into the blockchain in Zcash. Because with an open, fully transparent database, you can't put anything in there that you don't want everyone to see today. Whereas with an encrypted database, you could legitimately put information in there that is only supposed to be disclosed to yourself, your future self, or to a specific partner or specific authorized parties. So it could turn into a richer source of ex post facto auditing and investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of interesting use cases in a permission chain, right?
Yeah.
Where, let's say it's a network of financial institutions, they don't want their competitors to be seeing their transactions. That's
true.
a good example. Well, how about storing PII data? That's another way. So there are a lot of very interesting use cases for something like Zcash technology to provide in a permission chain. However, on the permissionless chain, you've got the negative side of the story, where, let's say, a sanctioned regime or some big money launderer wants to move cash, it becomes increasingly difficult for law enforcement.
Although there are some benefits potentially there as well, and one of them is about the PII data. Some of you will know about the travel rule, and the travel rule requires that for transactions over a certain amount, you attach some PII information to the payment. You could do that quite simply with Zcash, because you don't have to worry about other people seeing it. You can just say that the other person gets to see it. And the way that regulation applies to businesses in these in this space is they'll focus on regulated entities, and they can continue to do that. So if one of the exchanges out there today who allows you to trade Bitcoin decides to also list Zcash, they'll have the same regulatory focus, and they'll have the same requirements about understanding who they're doing business with. And from a law enforcement point of view, you can still go to those guys and say, all right, what have you done with these different customers? You just don't get those free links between entities that Bitcoin gives you.
Yeah.
It seems to me it's not it shouldn't be the anxiety-provoking thing that it is for law enforcement, because it just means that you have to go one hop at a time.
Right.
But it is going to blow their minds a little bit. I mean, when Bitcoin first came out, that sort of blew everyone's mind. It was in law enforcement. And now we're in Zcash. It's going to be like, whoa.
Remember,
I mean,
remember Bitcoin? Bitcoin's awesome compared to Zcash.
Yeah, I mean, they'll be loving Bitcoin, and
Right.
then you'll be like, what's this Zcash? And,
Right.
And there's so many legitimate reasons to have Zcash or other products like that, that's obviously the bigger part of the story. And like I said, you're building a product for consumers and other people to use. You're not building something for law enforcement so they can do their job better, although it happens to be compatible with some of their...
Yeah, and it's not, I didn't want to make it sound like it's a clear win. It might actually be better for law enforcement in some ways in the long run, but also probably worse in some ways.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, even to the extent it's worse, and it goes back to where we started, every innovation is not done with law enforcement in mind. It's done with the rest of the world in mind, and law enforcement has to play catch up. And there's nothing really unique about the challenge that Zcash presents, except it's just a different technology. But the fundamental issues are still the same.
Well, law enforcement would ban cash, right? Cash is clearly the easiest way to conduct a criminal transaction and the most used way.
Right.
If it was up to today, we wouldn't have cash. It's sort of like we hopefully get to have a measure of privacy in our life, just like when you're at your home, you can close the shades. Doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It just means you want to, for me, you like watch Sports Center in your boxers and eat a burrito, and you don't want the whole neighbors to see. I mean, maybe not the best use case, but,
right.
So.
All right, I'm going to Brian's house after this.
Yeah.
So,
Shades will
Brian,
be closed.
going forward, what do you think is the greatest challenge for law enforcement as they investigate criminal activity involving the blockchain? Where do you think they'll be focusing their attention going forward?
I just think it's getting people at a consistent level of knowledge. When I was a federal prosecutor, prosecutors understood how cell phones work. They understood how to subpoena bank records. So they weren't afraid of these technologies. And they know that people use cell phones for legitimate reasons. They have cell phones. So as law enforcement gets more familiar with these technologies, and frankly owns a Bitcoin or buys a Z dollar or whatever we're going to call it, that will help the process. And I think, frankly, this conference itself, this kind of thing, we're in New York City, we got all the biggest players in the world from the financial sector here interested in these technologies. That's a big step up from where we were 2 to 3 years ago. So I think just getting the comfort level up and continuing that education process.
Let me add something. So if you look at what law enforcement is focused on today, it's theft and money laundering, theft of assets and using the framework to do money laundering. No matter what system you have, you're still going to have theft of assets. But blockchain framework does not stop it. You can mitigate it using multi-signature wallets and so on, but it's not going to stop it. So I believe with all these services, there's going to be a lot more theft happening, and as a result, law enforcement is going to have a hard time tracking the movement of money from after accounts have been stolen. So that's where the big problem is, theft of assets. Whether it's a permission chain where money's removed or a permissionless chain where it's a consumer account.
And my concern is that, there's a lot of startups in this space and they get one subpoena or one knock on the door and it cripples their business. It cripples their ability to raise money, cripples their ability to innovate. And a lot of times, from what I see, it's law enforcement is killing a mouse with a missile, And that's my worry, and I think just overall about what could happen here. Even though these are legitimate things to pursue, there needs to be some scope and some sense of balance in how they're doing it.
I think it's important for the companies, though, building businesses in the space to realize that they are subject to that regulation. They do have to have robust programs in place. And the more successful your business is, the more likely it is the regulators are going to pay attention to you.
Yeah, you could have, so going back to the theft of assets part, everybody's trying to develop a permission chain, every industry, every sector. Eventually, they're all going to interact in some way. They're going to be pegged side chains going through permissionless chains. So once criminals figure out a way to take over an account in one permission chain, they can move the assets anywhere they want. So that's going to be our big problem that we're going to see.
Yeah, it's those gateways that I think where you change between asset classes are the interesting points.
Exactly.
So it's the exchanges you want to continue to focus on.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you, Brian, that education engagement is huge. Just in the 5 months we've been educating law enforcement in the Alliance, that the level of understanding and the depth of understanding, I think, has increased dramatically. It didn't occur to me to actually buy them Bitcoins, but maybe that'll be what we'll do in the next stage. But I think we have a little bit of time for questions. We have a lot of really good questions, including, believe it or not, one from Thomas Jefferson.
Wow.
who I didn't realize was here. But let me ask you guys, we hear a lot
He's
about
vying to get back on the $20 bill.
That's right. That's right. He's
Maybe you can be on the Z dollar.
we hear a lot about Bitcoin being used as the payment for ransomware schemes. If transactions are traceable, why can't we see who these payments are going to? Why aren't law enforcement officers catching the people doing the ransomware, James?
So that's something we're seeing a lot of now. So it's probably the biggest use case that law enforcement come to us with. And that's partly through the ease of which you can get ransomware software now. You can go and buy it off the dark web, and it's a great business model. The guy who sells the software takes a cut of everyone's ransomware transactions. What they are now, in some cases, we have been successful in tracing them. So it's a growing area of education for law enforcement. In a lot of cases, they're going through mixing services, or they're going straight into an account at a dark marketplace. And in those cases, it's taking a little longer to start to trace through. But it's something that law enforcement are very actively working on.
Well, and I think one of the other issues is it does take a long time to investigate those things. Bitcoin is a borderless payment system. So someone can be some part of the world that's ransoming, doing these things. It's very hard to track down. I mean, Jason and I were both in the Department of Justice to get a foreign country to agree to let you get documents from some person there or some bank. That takes months. I mean, it's not that quick. It's not the movies. It's not, you can't just get something in a day. So I think there's this.
It can happen.
There's a time lag on all these things.
That's
It's
exactly
So the
very
people
long.
demanding ransom are in an uncooperative jurisdiction?
Often, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
we've seen that in my past. We've seen a lot of that where people sit in uncooperative jurisdictions.
And that was before Bitcoin, right? That was the same thing was happening.
In traditional payment.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to say that this is another place where the history lesson comes in handy. Ransomware has been around since before anybody
Exactly.
ever heard of Bitcoin. That it used to be prepaid access cards, it used to be PayPal, it used to be Western Union when I started. That's how the payments were done. And they gravitated to Bitcoin because it's easier. For the same reason that most of us like to use it. It's fast, it's convenient, it's efficient. And but the problem is one of cybersecurity. It's not a Bitcoin problem. The problem is that someone is able to get on your system and put malware there.
Exactly.
In this case, ransomware. It could be anything. But all the same vulnerabilities that lead to Target getting hacked or the Bank of Bangladesh getting hacked are the same things that cause people to get ransomware in their machines. Bitcoin is the symptom of the problem, or a piece of the mechanism for payment, but it's not the underlying cause of the problem.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. I don't see anybody give me the hook.
It seems like the purpose of your technology can be at odds with each other, where with the attack executed cash encrypted, so it's harder to protect. Zcash, so before you provide that service to the consumer, are you doing any kind of EPL checks or SPL checks?
You asking me? Zcash is just a cryptographic technology that we've written some source code and put it up in open source on GitHub, and you can go download it right now. We don't provide any services or have any relationships with anyone. Yeah. So we do have relationships with potential partners, banks, fintech startups, healthcare industry. Turns out to be really sensitive to this kind of issue. They also want to use blockchains. They also have extremely strong regulatory requirements around privacy. And so those people are very interested in that question you asked. And for them, I tell them that the selective transparency property that comes out of the cryptography is imminently compatible with them satisfying their obligations and helping out people like law enforcement and using services like Elliptic in order to do so. Because you can reveal the information. For example, if you were an exchange and Elliptic was a service provider of yours and you were asking Elliptic to help you analyze the risk associated with certain transactions, you're privileged to see those transactions in the blockchain, and you can extend that privilege to Elliptic so that it can perform its visualization or analytics on that. So it works.
And so, for example, the healthcare provider with all the key
Yeah. So the question was, would would a healthcare provider be able to control the access to the data in a blockchain using that kind of technology? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. This is from Andrew Jackson. Why am I not on the $20 bill anymore? No, we do have one. How sophisticated, for Prakash and James, how sophisticated do you think the AML and compliance functions are at the typical blockchain company? Are they anywhere close to legacy finance institutions?
Yeah, I think actually I've heard numerous cases of banks coming in and having a look at the programs that are in place and seeing that they're way more comprehensive than what's in place at more of the traditional money laundering institutions.
And I've heard that too. The law enforcement, they're always impressed. They're like, oh my God, you guys are so up to speed. And it's because they're buying the latest technology. They're really vigorous about it. I mean, it is sort of remarkable. The people who are having the biggest problems look at HSBC, right? These big, huge conglomerates with tentacles all over the world.
So these are AML, KYC compliant companies.
Yes.
Let's caveat
Yes.
that.
The compliant ones are really
Not
compliant.
those fly-by-night exchanges.
That's right. Right, so it turns out there was a clock up there the whole time that I didn't see. So we are over. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Afterwards, thank you for joining us.